Professor Eleanor Vance collected accolades the way other people collect stamps. Her office wasn't just decorated with degrees, it was practically built out of them. Framed journal covers with her name on them lined the walls, and a prestigious Fields Medal, the highest honor in mathematics, served as a very expensive paperweight on her desk. By every measure, she was a titan in theoretical physics. But her greatest pride wasn't an award. It was a problem she'd created. She called it the Vance conjecture. And in the hallowed halls of the university, it was a legend. For 2 decades, it had stood unbeaten, a mathematical Everest that had defeated Nobel laureates and wonderkins alike. Vance didn't just teach her classes, she held court. The conjecture was her crown jewel, a symbol of an intellectual peak so high only she could truly appreciate the view. She loved to unveil it, to watch the ambition in her students' eyes curdle into confusion and then despair. It was a monument to her own genius and a brutal reminder to everyone else of their limits. Professor Vance had a favorite, cruel little joke she liked to tell her graduate students. She'd stand before the vast blackboard, a smug smile on her lips, and declare, "Solve this, and I'll marry you." The lecture hall would always fill with nervous laughter. But on one cold November afternoon, as the laughter died down, a hand reached for the chalk. It didn't belong to a student or a fellow professor. It belonged to the man who emptied the trash cans. And in the silence that followed, everything Professor Vance thought she knew about genius and worth was about to be shattered. Eleanor Vance didn't walk, she strode. Her steps echoed with an authority that went beyond her academic credentials. She saw the world as a series of problems, and people as variables, some useful, most irrelevant. Her lectures were less about teaching and more about performing. She'd fill acres of blackboard with elegant, terrifying symbols, her voice booming with the certainty of a woman who has never been truly challenged. Her favorite topic, the Vance conjecture, was a labyrinth of a problem. Now, we should be clear, you won't find the Vance conjecture in any textbook. It's a fictional puzzle, but it represents a very real kind of academic dragon, a problem so vast it seems to guard a treasure of cosmic secrets. In our story, it was a fiendishly complex equation, trying to build a bridge between the cosmic grandeur of Calabi-Yau manifolds and the chaotic fizz of quantum fluctuations. It was basically a search for a map of discrete spacetime, a unified theory that had eluded even giants like Hawking. Vance, of course, claimed she once debated the topic with them over sherry, a claim with absolutely no evidence. "Observe," she would command, her expensive chalk dancing across the slate. The equation was a thing of terrible beauty, a string of integrals and tensors that snaked across the board like a serpent. For 20 years, the finest minds have thrown themselves against this wall, and for 20 years, they have been broken. Her students, some of the brightest minds the university could find, just stared, a mix of awe and pure intimidation on their faces. They scribbled furiously, not trying to solve it, but just trying to understand the question. Among them was Leo, a doctoral candidate with a rare intuitive grasp of multidimensional geometry. He was brilliant, but also cautious, a trait Vance despised. She saw his potential, and it annoyed her that he wouldn't just bulldoze through problems with the same arrogant force she did. One afternoon, she aimed her challenge directly at him. Leo had dared to ask a question, pointing out a potential inconsistency. Vance stopped cold, a predator sensing a tremor. She turned slowly. "An inconsistency, Mr. Dantzig? You believe you found a flaw in my life's work?" "Not a flaw, Professor, just in the scalar field's application under extreme gravitational—" She cut him off with a wave. No, please, enlighten us." She walked back to the main equation, tapping it dramatically. "The answer is here, the entire universe in a single line. But it requires a spark of true genius, not timid baby steps." She looked right at him, and the smug smile returned. "You know my standing offer, Mr. Dantzig. Solve this equation, and I'll marry you." The lecture hall erupted in uncomfortable laughter. It was a familiar piece of theater, but today it felt personal, aimed to humiliate. Leo's face flushed crimson. He shrank back in his seat, his brilliant mind silenced, not by the math, but by the casual cruelty of his mentor. Professor Vance turned back to the board, satisfied. The message was sent: do not question the queen. Every evening, long after Vance's voice had faded, Thomas Finch would push his cart into the massive lecture hall. Thomas was a man made invisible by his uniform. At 58, his face was a roadmap of quiet hardship, his hands calloused from decades of manual labor. He was polite, silent, and efficient. To everyone else, he was just part of the building, the quiet force that reset the world each night. No one knew that before he picked up a mop, Thomas had once picked up scholarships. No one knew that his small, threadbare apartment wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a library, crammed floor to ceiling with worn paperbacks on quantum mechanics and advanced physics texts he'd bought for pennies at second-hand shops. They were relics of a life he'd been forced to leave behind. A promising career in astrophysics was cut short decades ago by a family tragedy that demanded his full-time presence and a steady, unglamorous paycheck. He had traded a telescope for a broom, the mysteries of the cosmos for the predictable patterns of a cleaning route. But the hunger never left him. The numbers, the patterns, the big cosmic questions, they were part of his soul. So for years, he had been a ghost in the university, silently auditing the greatest lectures of his generation. He'd linger in the back of halls, pretending to sweep, absorbing discussions on string theory. He read the papers students threw away and worked through problems in spiral notebooks he kept hidden in his cart. Professor Vance's lecture hall was his favorite. The woman's arrogance was a bitter pill, but the math on the board was intoxicating. He would stand there in the empty room, lit only by the humming fluorescent lights, and just study the Vance conjecture. He felt no intimidation, only a deep, profound curiosity. He saw the equation not as a monument to one woman's ego, but as a conversation with the universe. He had filled 3 entire notebooks trying to solve it, approaching it from dozens of angles Vance had dismissed. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just listening to the quiet music of the numbers. He worked not with frantic ambition, but with the patient reverence of a craftsman. And slowly, over months of lonely nights, he began to feel the lock beginning to turn. It was a Tuesday. A special colloquium had been arranged, and Professor Vance was at her most grandiose. She announced she had added a final, insurmountable layer to the conjecture. "This," she declared, gesturing to the equation that now covered 3 blackboards, "is the final seal. It is now, I believe, fundamentally beyond our reach. We'll need a new Newton, a new Einstein to even begin to chip away at it." The room was a sea of defeated faces. When the lecture ended, people filed out in a kind of funerary silence. Thomas began his work. As he swept, he saw Leo still at his desk, his head in his hands.
He finished sweeping and started wiping down the blackboards, but when he got to the center board, he paused. He looked at the new edition, the final seal Vance was so proud of. Thomas stared, his brow furrowed, and then he saw it. It wasn't a seal. It was a key. In her attempt to make the problem harder, Vance had accidentally created a paradox, a feedback loop that, if manipulated correctly, would cause the entire structure to collapse into a single, elegant solution. It was a mistake born of pure hubris. Vance was so focused on building a bigger wall that she hadn't noticed she'd built it in the shape of a door. Just then, Professor Vance strode back into the room, having forgotten her briefcase. She saw Thomas standing before the board, rag in hand, staring intently at the equation. "What do you think you're doing?" Vance's voice dripped with disdain. Admiring the view? It's a bit outside your pay grade, don't you think? The few students still in the room fell silent, watching. Thomas didn't turn around. His voice was quiet but firm. "Professor," he said, his eyes fixed on the board, "there's a more elegant approach." A beat of stunned silence, then a snort of laughter from Vance. "An elegant approach? From you?" She looked around at the students, a wide, mocking grin on her face. "Well, well, it seems we have a hidden genius in our midst. The man who cleans the floors has an opinion." Thomas finally turned. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet certainty. "Your final variable," he said calmly. "It creates a recursive symmetry. You constrained it, but you should have left it unbounded. It doesn't seal the equation, it solves it." Vance's face went from amused to furious. The sheer audacity. This janitor was correcting her in front of her students. She decided to make an example of him, to crush him completely. "Is that so?" she sneered. "You think you've solved what has baffled Fields medalists for 2 decades? You, who can barely solve the scuff marks on the linoleum?" The students winced. "Then by all means," Vance continued, picking up a fresh piece of chalk and holding it out to Thomas like an executioner's offering. "Show us. Dazzle us with your janitorial wisdom." She leaned in close, whispering for only Thomas to hear. "Go on. I dare you. Embarrass yourself." The room was dead quiet. Everyone expected Thomas to stammer an apology and retreat into the invisibility he was paid for. Instead, he took the chalk. His calloused fingers wrapped around the smooth white cylinder. He turned his back on the professor and took the long, silent walk to the center of the vast blackboard. The only sound was the soft scuff of his worn work boots on the floor. The tension in the room was so thick you could feel it. The remaining students stood frozen. Professor Vance crossed her arms, a predatory smirk on her face, waiting for the failure she knew was coming. Thomas stood before the board for a long moment. He wasn't hesitating, he was centering himself. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the noise of the room, the arrogant professor, the gawking students, the years of frustration, all fade away. There was only him and the board. Then he began to write. The first sound was a soft tap as chalk met slate. It wasn't the frantic scratching of a student or the arrogant flourish of Vance. It was the calm, confident stroke of a master. He didn't attack the equation head-on. Instead, he started in a blank space to the right, writing a single, seemingly unrelated theorem from an obscure subfield of topology. Vance's smirk faltered. She recognized it, but it was totally irrelevant. What was this old man doing? Then Thomas drew a bridge. With a few deft lines, he linked that obscure theorem to the very core of the Vance conjecture. A gasp came from one of the students. It was Leo. His eyes were wide. He wasn't just solving the equation, he was reframing the entire problem. Line by line, Thomas dismantled the conjecture. He didn't break it, he unfolded it. He used Vance's own insurmountable variable as a lever, prying the whole thing open. The recursive symmetry he'd mentioned became a cascade. Complexities canceled out. Paradoxes resolved into elegant simplicities. It was like watching a master watchmaker assemble a fantastically complex timepiece. The smirk on Vance's face was gone, replaced with profound confusion. She stepped closer, scanning the lines, hunting for a mistake. There was none. The logic was pristine, flawless. It was beautiful. The only sound in the universe was the tap, scrape, tap-tap of the chalk. Thomas's hand moved with a grace that defied his age and profession. This wasn't the hand of a janitor, it was the hand of a creator. He was nearing the end. The terrifying equation that had covered 3 blackboards was now reduced to a single, simple line of equivalence. An answer so stunningly simple, it felt like it had been hiding there all along. Thomas wrote the final character. He underlined it with a firm stroke. Then he set the chalk down in the tray. The soft click echoed in the dead silence. He turned around, his face calm. He hadn't done this for them. He had done it for the love of the problem. The silence that followed was a physical thing. The students stood like statues, their minds scrambling. Leo had tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming awe. Professor Eleanor Vance was pale, her mouth hanging slightly. She looked from Thomas to the blackboard and back again. The fortress she had built for 20 years had been brought down in under 5 minutes by the man who cleaned her office. The smug certainty that had defined her life evaporated, leaving a terrifying void. She walked toward the blackboard in a trance. Her elegant fingers, which had always handled chalk with such arrogance, now trembled as they traced the lines of Thomas's proof. She followed the logic, step by beautiful step. She saw the leap she'd never considered, the connection right in front of her, obscured by her own pride. She saw how her own seal was the very thing that made the solution possible. The janitor hadn't just found an answer. He had used Vance's own ego against her. "It's correct," Vance whispered, the words sounding hoarse and stolen. She said it again, louder this time, as if trying to force the reality into her shattered worldview. "It's correct." She turned to Thomas. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something Vance hadn't felt since she was a girl struggling with her first algebra lesson. Pure, unadulterated awe. "Who are you?" she asked. The question wasn't a demand. It was a plea. Thomas allowed a small, sad smile. "My name is Thomas Finch."
But how? Vance gestured helplessly at the board. "This is a life's work. You don't just figure it out." "I had a lot of quiet nights to think about it," Thomas said simply. Just then, a single sound broke the silence, the sound of one person clapping. It was Leo. He was on his feet, his face lit up. Then another student joined in, then another. Soon, the small hall was filled with thunderous applause. It wasn't just for the math. It was for the quiet man in the gray uniform who had reminded them that genius doesn't wear a label. Vance just stood there, a fallen queen in her own court, finally seeing the world as it was, not as she'd wished it to be. The janitor hadn't just solved her equation. He had solved the professor herself. The story of Professor Vance and the janitor, Thomas Finch, is a powerful one. It's also important to state that it's a work of fiction. Professor Vance, Thomas Finch, and the Vance conjecture don't exist. The tale is an allegory, a piece of modern folklore that speaks to a deeper truth about where we look for intelligence and where we actually find it. It's a story told in many forms, from viral videos to blockbuster films, because it taps into a fundamental hope that worth isn't determined by a title, and genius can be found in the most unexpected places. But while our characters are fictional, the phenomenon is very real. The underdog genius who solves a problem thought to be impossible has a famous real-life precedent, a man named George Dantzig. In 1939, Dantzig was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. One day, he arrived late to his statistics class and saw 2 problems written on the blackboard. Assuming they were homework, he copied them down. A few days later, he handed in the assignment, apologizing to his professor, George Dantzig, because the problems seemed to be a little harder than usual. He had no idea what he'd just done. Those weren't homework problems. They were 2 of the most famous unsolved problems in statistics. Professor Dantzig, realizing what his student had accomplished, was so stunned he could barely speak. Those 2 homework problems later became the basis for Dantzig's doctoral thesis. Dantzig himself later said that if he had known the problems were considered unsolved, he probably would have been too intimidated to even try. He solved them because he didn't know he wasn't supposed to. This real-life event served as a loose inspiration for the iconic scene in the film Good Will Hunting, where a janitor at MIT anonymously solves a fiendishly difficult problem on a hallway blackboard. So what do these stories teach us? They show that the biggest barriers to discovery are often the ones we build in our own minds. We're conditioned to believe genius belongs to a select few, nurtured only in elite institutions. We look for it in the professor, but overlook the janitor. We respect the diploma, but dismiss the person holding the broom. The ultimate lesson is one of profound humility. It's recognizing that every mind is its own universe. The person you dismiss in the hallway, the quiet colleague you underestimate, they might just hold the key. True intelligence isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about being open to the idea that an answer can come from anywhere and from anyone. It's the wisdom to never, ever judge a book by its cover. The story of Thomas Finch is a reminder that potential is everywhere, often hiding in plain sight. Have you ever underestimated someone only to be completely amazed by their hidden talent or wisdom? Share your story in the comments below. These stories remind us all to look a little closer at the world around us. And if you believe that genius deserves to be seen, not hidden, subscribe for more stories that challenge our assumptions and celebrate the extraordinary potential within the ordinary person. In the weeks that followed, the university was a changed place. The story of what happened in Lecture Hall 204 spread like wildfire, becoming a campus legend. Thomas Finch was no longer invisible. Students greeted him in the hallways with a new kind of respect. They didn't just see a janitor. They saw the man who humbled Professor Vance. Eleanor Vance did not in fact marry Thomas Finch, but she did something far more important. She recommended Thomas for a full tenured professorship, a move that sent shockwaves through the academic world. She didn't just give Thomas a job, she gave him back the life that had been stolen from him decades earlier. The two of them, once separated by a vast social and intellectual gulf, became colleagues. They were often seen in Vance's office, the former Titan and the former janitor working together at the blackboard, equals in their shared pursuit of truth. The Vance conjecture was renamed the Vance-Finch theorem, a permanent testament to their unlikely partnership. The story reminds us that the world's toughest equations aren't always mathematical. Sometimes they're about class, assumption, and prejudice. And solving them requires not just a brilliant mind, but an open heart. It's about having the courage to pick up the chalk and the humility to recognize genius, no matter what uniform it wears.